Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thanks very much for joining us. May I please call you to change your names to your real names and to add the country right after your name so we get a sense when everybody's connecting, particularly Sean, because we have been together and we kind of know where your comrades are connecting from. But thanks again for joining, and we're really happy to have today with us Sean Sweeney, Comrade Sean Sweeney, who is actually heading the very famous trade unions for energy and democracy. Amazing work that is coming from trade unions for energy and democracy, particularly leading the efforts in terms of articulating an alternative vision of energy transition. So many thanks, Sean, for joining us from the US this morning. We really appreciate it. Your video lecture was very important to lay down some of the key challenges confronting Labour when it comes to the debate on energy transition. And I think it would be helpful. People have watched your video lecture, or they should have watched your video lecture, but it would be extremely helpful if you could perhaps outline these key challenges just to start the conversation. And to everyone, please, you can either add your questions in the chat box, or even better, raise your hand once Sean gives us brings us to speed with the conversation on the challenges when it comes to energy transition. So Sean, over to you, and thanks again.
Thanks, comrade. Thanks, Adelira. It's great to see so many people interested in this subject, and congratulations to you all, and also for the GLU team for getting this course up and running. Adelira is right. That I would say that the challenges facing energy sector workers are very similar to the challenges faced in a lot of industries where there is cutthroat competition, global supply chain challenges. And in my video, I talked a little bit about not just the problems of energy transition, which are very relevant and will be relevant for the next several decades. And I'll try to go into a little bit of detail why it's so important for trade unionists and their allies in the social movements to try, although it's difficult and can be intimidating, try to engage, because it will be on the agenda for the next several decades and at the center. And I say that because in my youth, which is quite some time ago now, energy was not a political issue, right? No one knew. You put the plug in the wall and the power came out and your TV worked and your refrigerator worked. No one asked any questions about where energy comes from, very rarely. And I'm talking, of course, in the global north. So here we have a situation now where there is a change is going on in the energy sector all over the world. And those changes have been described as positive for the planet, because the idea is to move away from highly polluting coal, oil, and gas, polluting in the sense of the immediate impact of those resources on the earth, but also the effect of climate change, of the warming of the Earth's temperatures because of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that get trapped in the atmosphere and stay there for many decades. So the car that is going down the street outside your window now is generating carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide that will stay in the atmosphere for many decades, or it will go into the oceans and other water supply. So this is something that we are dealing with as a civilization. But in terms of in the video, I highlighted a few challenges. First of all, workers in the sector are struggling to know what's happening. There's a lot of uncertainty. If you're in coal, oil, and gas, particularly coal, jobs, particularly again in the global north, are being phased out, consciously so. And that's to do with environment policy, but it's also to do with deindustrialization. So there's no longer the same need for coal as there were, because most of the factories in the world are no longer in the global north. You know this already. They're moving to the global south, or have moved already. And so this also, we see new industries coming onto the scene. In the last 20 years, the wind industry and the solar industry, but also the electric vehicles industry, is growing very quickly. And the main driver of that growth in terms of the technologies is China. So that China is the dominant force in solar panel production, something like 80% of world supply, electric vehicles, and also increasingly wind turbines. So this is all happening. It's very difficult to know what's happening to workers in the sector. We know that there are quite high levels of worker exploitation all over the world, and it's all countries are guilty of this. So even where there's a solar industry, for example, in the United States, or a solar industry in Europe, they're mostly sourcing from overseas, and the installation work that's being done to put these solar panels on roofs or on fields is very cheap labor, mostly non-union and temporary. So that's the question of uncertainty and deteriorating working conditions. Now, two more quick points. One of the things, though, that we need to be aware of is, what is this all for, this transition? If it's to move from dirty energy, coal, oil, and gas, towards clean energy, renewable energy, wind, solar, other forms of renewable energy, it could be, or one could conclude that that's okay. You know, the social damage is a problem, the working conditions is a problem, but at least we're going to get clean energy and a clean environment out of this. Unfortunately, that is not what's happening. So what we've done with the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy is to document in meticulous detail, and I emphasize this, meticulous detail, what is going on in the global energy system. And we've concluded that what we're seeing is an energy expansion, not an energy transition. So what that means in simple language is that all forms of energy are growing in terms of their use. So, for example, last year, and I'm not picking on China, but I'm pointing to China's energy use just to illustrate what is really a global phenomenon. China's increase in energy consumption was more than the entire energy consumption of the African continent. The increase was more than the entire energy consumption. And 80% of that increase was met by coal, oil, and gas. Its renewables sector is by far the fastest growing wind and solar industries on the planet, massive new projects. But it doesn't alter the fact that the whole economy in China, but also the global economy, growing at 3% or so a year on average, is sucking in and using more and more energy. So these are the dynamics we're dealing with. So we may end up with a double negative, and I'll conclude on this. The first negative is the working conditions are not good, union protections are being eroded, and therefore the precariousness that we see in other sectors, electronics, textiles, building and construction, all of those things are happening in the energy sector. But the other negative is it's not actually the policy to protect the environment and to control the levels of climate change is also not effective, because there is this ongoing energy expansion. Now, what do we do as a movement? And this is, and I'm sure you appreciate this is a very tough challenge. First of all, we need to understand what is going on. Forget the headlines. When you hear that the energy transition to clean energy is inevitable, that renewables are growing at phenomenal speed and it's going to be great for everybody, take that with a huge dose of skepticism. Look at the details. Secondly, so no, we need to know what's going on, but then we need our own transformative vision of the global energy system, because it is acknowledged by the scientific community. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has thousands of scientists working 24 hours a day, it seems, to produce data on what's going on in terms of the effect of this energy use on the world's climate. And they have concluded that we need to reduce emissions very quickly in order to stabilize the climate and prevent what could be catastrophic outcomes decades from now. Now, if that is the scientific consensus, and very few people in the policy world challenge that, then what we have to say as a movement is your policies are not effective in terms of apprehending and controlling energy use, let alone decarbonizing, that's the word they use, the supply of energy. So as difficult as it is, given we're all busy union people trying to, fight for workers every day, trying to organize, we have to pay attention to this question, because there will be major struggles in the future around energy. We have to have a transformative vision. And if there's time, I can go into more detail about what that vision might look like, but that's for the movement to decide what that vision is. But we must pay attention and be involved. And I feel, and I'll conclude on this point, I feel that if we get this issue right from a planetary and a human perspective, and all life on the planet is affected by this, then the relevance of the global trade union movement would never be as significant as it is. In other words, it's going to be more significant in the future as a movement because of this planetary and civilizational threat of climate change and ecological breakdown. So I think we have a big responsibility, but it can be a lot of fun as well. I mean, it's not all negative. There is so much to learn about this issue, but it does require tenacity from activists and a collective approach. Get involved, try to study. If there are things you don't understand, let's work together to develop our collective learning. And from that, we will develop the sort of transformative politics that we need as a movement in order to engage in this discussion. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that might trigger a few comments.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, for this really insightful summary of the key points. And even you went more in depth on some very important arguments in the video lecture, but also for giving us a bit of hope, because often these debates end up making everybody very depressed about the future of the world. So, okay, so it's open for questions, comments. Please, we have about 45 minutes with Comrade Sean to pick his brains.
Pick my brain.
So
I have the chat open, so if there's anything there, I can also.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. That's fantastic. Sean, while people are perhaps warming up a bit, why is it so important, this point you're making that about energy expansion? And why is it so dangerous, that point of the fact that there is no thinking yet to really change our model of production, if you like, which is still related to expansion of consumption and continuation of this kind of crazy way of life for particular segments in society, of course. So why is that conversation important for Labour? Because it gets somehow lost in the whole debate, as if we move tomorrow to the renewables, things would be solved. And Comrade Wizzy, I come right after to you.
Yeah, I see the comrade's hand up. I'll just answer briefly. I think we're learning something about capitalism here. First of all, that the growth dynamics in capitalism that we're all familiar with are very difficult to control. So policy, on the one hand, is trying to control it with a theory they call ecological modernization, or simpler, green growth. The idea that you can continue to grow, we can continue to produce more things, but it will be greener. So our production methods will change, and we will, at one point, at one day, it'll all be greener and greener and greener. This is the common policy paradigm. And 30 years of this green growth model, which was developed as a theory, has not produced any slowing down of emissions increases. So the policy cannot control the level of expansion. It can't do anything about it. So that raises a question then, well, what can be done about it? And this is where the whole issue of workers' power and popular power comes in. Because, just as we wouldn't, we wouldn't let our cat carry on, you would change the cat litter every week, right? You don't let it carry on and pile up in your front room. So it's the same kind of thing. We can control it, and we have to try to have a vision of a sustainable levels of consumption. Everybody should have their basic needs met, but the levels of waste across the capitalist economy are because there's no market in conservation of energy or reduction of vital use materials and minerals. So that's, I think, we're up against the old problem of capitalist destruction, not just of human labor, but also of what they call natural capital. So I think that this is the big picture, the big narrative that we need to address, but we need to address it concretely, not in abstractions. Because I can agree with you, we need a more sustainable world, but then how do we fight for that? What's the step-by-step process? So anyway, I don't want to interrupt the conversation any further, but thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. Comrade Wesi, please.
Thank you for recognizing me. Sean, thank you so much for your very insight explanation. I am particularly interested in this contradiction where you indicate about what's happening in China, which at the moment is amongst the major polluters of the world, but at the same time, they are producing up to 80% of solar equipment, as well as quite a lot of electric vehicles. But in the production of green energy, we also note that they are increasingly contributing to the pollution of the globe. How prepared can the labor movement be to balance these two? Because it seems to be a very, very contradictory approach. I thought I should have your thoughts on that, Sean, and the rest of the members. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Wizzy. Should we take a couple more, Adlira, do you think?
We could, yeah. Coffee, would you like, so let's take 2 by 2. So people can also kind of make the connection to the question. Comrade Coffee, do you want to go?
Yes, please. Thank you, Adlira. Good afternoon to everyone. I share the same concern as my comrade Wizzy just asked. I have, right from the beginning, when I did the Just and Green course, I shared my worries that I hope this will not be another attempt to create panic in the system, where those that are equally emerging into production or industrialization will be made to think that their methods of production is not the right one. And therefore, the issue of green energy, which we know that technically is quite expensive, and trying to look for the just transition so that emerging economies can equally come along. But here is the case that the giants that claim that they are actually going to frontier or lead the just transition are equally expanding in the use of these fossil fuel or other things that pollute the environment. My concern is that to what extent, I know that labor power is great, but as far as finances and capital is concerned, these things require a lot of muscles when it comes to finances or capital. Are the labor movements from where you sit, are we really positioned in terms of, apart from our collective powers, in terms of campaigns and other things, are we in a position to fight against these strong economies and the way they are going about things? And can we also initiate maybe an investigation or a research into why they are producing 80% of green energy, but whatever they are doing in terms of their production, they are also polluting more of the environment? Can we also go into that and find out what is accounting for this contradictory position? That is what I want to find out. Thank you.
Good questions, very much. Very good. Should I jump in, or
I think let's take 2 by 2. Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I'll start with Kofi's question, because I think Wesley's question is somewhat related. And I'll start with the main question is do we have the power, right? Is there anything we can do? Now, there are different types of power, of course, from a trade union perspective. Can we call a global general strike to save the planet and expect success? No, we cannot. But what we can do is to work on the fact that there is among the political establishment in the world today, the elite, the global elite, are extremely anxious about the environmental crisis. So their anxiety is based on facts. It's based on scientific evidence. And so they then come up with a policy to do something about it that has been a miserable failure. So the weakness is also on their side, in the sense that they cannot solve the problem that they have created. And that is the problem of capitalist expansion and energy use and pollution and climate change. Now, how do we respond to that? First of all, we need to have, if we can say there are different approaches that need to be put in place, that public control over energy is the first most important demand that we need to fight for. Now, public control over energy that serves a capitalist system is not going to do very much, but public control of energy that can drive energy efficiency, conservation, decarbonization of supply, and there are not just wind and solar can contribute to this. There are many other forms of energy: geothermal energy, tidal energy, nuclear energy, although that's more controversial. There are possibilities to decarbonize the supply of energy in the global economy. So what we don't have is numbers on the ground to fight for these things. But that's partially due because we have not presented a clear vision of an alternative. Thus, in my video, I referred to the lack of a transformational politics that we need to put into the debate. We got to get away from the challenge that, oh, our jobs will be lost in the energy transition, so therefore we need to complain. That's not going to do it. We need to develop this alternative. Now, the contradiction that you refer to in terms of, let's say, China, well, China's story is the story of the world. It's not any different in qualitatively speaking. So you've got a situation where the massive growth of renewable energy in China is becoming a global market for them. They sell these panels and make money. So how do we get away from this sort of commodification of, or the turning into profit of energy technologies? Now, where do we look for this? We know that the United Nations in 1991, under the United Nations Framework Convention, said there must be sharing on a needs basis of environmentally useful technologies. So it's in writing that needs to, so we can organize around those commitments that were made at the global level. The problem, I think, as a movement is we don't even know those commitments exist. So we don't know how to engage in the discussion. I'll share with you, if there's time, a paper on energy poverty. I neglected to mention that, there's 1 billion people on the planet who have no electricity or inadequate supply. In fact, it's much more than that if you're talking about inadequate supply. And most of those people live in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's because of the policies of structural adjustment of the 1980s and 90s that crippled public utilities that there was a lack of electrification in Africa. Now, think of this. You've got a continent that has more sun than any other continent, more wind than most other continents, and yet it has less wind and solar power than Spain. So Spain has more wind and solar power than the entire continent of Africa. Now, there is something there we can organize around in rural areas, in countries that have energy poverty, to say we need, and we must fight for a new public pathway approach to the energy transition so that everybody can have a decent life. Now, these are not easy things to say. They're easy to say, they're not easy to organize around. But it's better, I think, to have clear demands and a strategy than to say, for example, we need a new system which is more sustainable. That's not going to get us very far. So that's why we're having these kind of discussions, is to engage on that level. I'm not sure if I did justice to the questions, but I thought I would add those points. I see one. Thank you, comrade.
Thank you very much. Really, thanks so much, Sean. I think there was another hand up. I just can't remember whose hand was it. So please.
Yeah, hello.
Okay, comrade. Yeah, please go ahead.
Good evening. I'm Sarveswar from India. Actually, my question is that there are some observation, because big solar plant, they require huge tract of land for their plants. So in the context of India, that these companies, they fall back upon the land of the indigenous communities, because it is easy, because most of the land there are in common property nature. So it leads to displacement. So how to address kind of issues? My question is the land that is emerging out of. So I hope I able to communicate my.
That's clear. That's clear what you said.
Thank you very much, Sarbasara. And Eben, do you want to make your question too?
Yes, Alira. Good afternoon to everyone, and I want to appreciate our resource person for the discussion is leading us today. The discussion of just transition is a very important topic to be looked at, and from the point that I am coming from, the labor perspective, I'm looking at the ways by which these discussions will be of a lot of benefit to labor. And that's why I was very happy when Comrade Kofi gave or highlighted some of these topics or discussions which we have really enumerated or had a lot of discussions on it. And if labor has the power, has the financial muscles and all those things to, again, fight capitalists and even addressing some of these things. But let me even move from that angle and go to issues on the challenges of energy transition with respect to developing countries, the challenges. So we know that developing countries have very poor infrastructure to support the transition process. A developing country like Ghana, we do not have the requisite infrastructure to support the transition process. The availability of technology is also a challenge. And also, even the lack of policies which will foster community energy transitions for a developing country like Ghana is another thing which we lack. So my question to Prof is, what can a developing country like Ghana do in addressing some of these challenges of energy transition I've posed or I've said? Thank you very much.
Great, great. Adlira, question. The comrade from India, I didn't catch his name. I saw.
Sarbesara.
Sorry?
Sarbesara.
Sabasara. Should I take that question first?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I'll jump
Whichever way
in.
goes well for you. Yeah.
Very, very good question. I mean, I'll give you another. My head is full of statistics, so forgive me if I give you too many, but here's one. Right. So you take the land use question is already a big challenge, and I'll give you an example from the US. In the US, there is a lot of people, a lot of farmers who are very poor. And even though the image of America is everybody's got loads of money, farmers in particular are not, and the same is true in many parts of the globe, all over the world. They can get more money covering their fields with solar panels from solar developers who get government subsidies to produce solar. The farmers get more money doing solar than they do growing vegetables, for example. Now, in a country like India, where you still have such a high levels of rural population, the land use struggle is going to probably intensify in terms of the space needed to generate the energy. For every, to produce, again, another statistic, but to produce 1 gigawatt of power, that's a lot of power, but you need something like 50 square kilometers of land in order to generate that amount of power. So this is a problem, again, of facing the transition, that there will be more land devoted to wind and solar power in the future. Now, how would we as a movement respond to that? We would need to engage in, is this land use justified? Can it be modified in any way? Is there another way of doing things? Why can it not be on every supermarket and every car park instead of in land? So those are those kind of questions. The other is, are there other forms of energy that we could use to substitute for this land use? And the last question is, how do we reduce energy consumption so a lot of energy that gets wasted can be used in a more efficient manner? These are the kind of technical debates that we as a movement need to engage in. Now, in terms of Ghana, I'll give an example, right? In Ghana, the government about 8 or 9 years ago cancelled its contracts with private renewable energy multinationals and paid, I believe, $490 million in compensation. And that's what explains why one of the reasons why Ghana, and that is true of sub-Saharan Africa more generally, does not have the infrastructure capacity, is because it's been locked into these contracts with private renewable energy companies, and therefore ends up its public energy systems get basically driven into bankruptcy. And I've done some research on this. I'm happy to share with you. It's called Reclaim and Restore Public Energy. And it's a set of demands to the World Bank to stop insisting on privatization of energy and allow countries like Ghana, who have entire populations nearly who need energy, to basically build public energy systems in the same way as was done all over the rest of the world. So there are, again, specific things that can be put forward into the debate. So the just transition in a country that, or a region of the world like sub-Saharan Africa that doesn't have enough electricity, for example, doesn't have enough energy, what are we talking about? It's not a transition from fossil fuels to renewables. They don't even have any energy. A lot of the rural populations don't have energy. So what is our energy vision for sub-Saharan Africa, for the areas of the world that don't have enough? And I'd like to, share with you some materials on that, which are available for further discussion, perhaps in a separate time, at a different time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sean. And please do share the materials, because then we can put it in the course platform and then people can study that further. I mean, there are lots of comments in the chat box. So it's also difficult to sum up, but I think you responded somehow to the question of Celine, in particular about the vulnerable people and the question of inequality, and I suppose also energy poverty. But can we perhaps get the question of Brian from the Philippines? Because I think we are getting, even yesterday, again and again, questions about the role of the private companies, private capital, and private sector in the question of energy transition. And I think it comes also because there is so much brainwashing about how important private capital is going to be for the transition. So is it possible, Sean, that you pick that up? Is the startup model, is the question, funded by venture capitalists, maybe, for new energy sources and technologies, a good model for addressing both the climate side and the labor issues? If not, what's the alternative? And I think, yeah, perhaps we take that one. And there is also a question from Agnes. I feel a bit bad because people are here. I shouldn't be reading the people's questions. So take Brian's.
I'll take Brian's first,
we take Agnes, and perhaps Agnes puts her question herself, because I saw her in the camera.
Yeah, so if Brian's question is very, very valid. There is no immediate way venture capital or commercial, traditional commercial loans can help the energy transition, particularly in the developing world. And I'll give, again, a couple of facts. For every $5 today invested in the global green economy, that's renewable energy, electric vehicles, so batteries, these things, only $1 is invested in the global south. So the global south represents 75% of the world's population, but only 1/5 of the investment. Now, why is that? It's because there is no money to be made providing basic services and electricity and energy to poor people. So what governments have done is they've tried to often subsidize, like you see, they subsidize the energy consumption. And then the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank tells them, no, 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 you can't do that. You must create an enabling environment, that's what they call it, for the private sector. But the private sector, and I urge you to consult some of the work we've done on this subject, the private sector will not invest unless they're guaranteed returns on investment. We're not talking about making T-shirts here. We're talking about the investment in energy infrastructure is high upfront costs and slow returns. That's assuming that the money that comes from the sale of electricity is sufficient to pay for the installation of the technologies to generate the electricity. The private sector looks at this and says, unless we have legally binding commitments by governments to pay for the electricity over a 25-year period, regardless of whether the people can afford to pay for it, we are not going to invest. So whatever model of capitalist investment you look at, unless you can solve that problem, they will not, there is no incentive for them to invest. And I urge you not to listen to me on this. Listen to the head of the IMF, Georgieva. Listen to the head of the World Bank in Africa. And what they're saying is there is no investment going into the region because of this lack of, they call it the risk return ratios. That's their language, not mine, are not conducive to investment. So this explains why so many people in the world today not only have dirty energy they have no energy. And I think there is no intrinsic profit to be made. And what we say as a movement is what we've said now for a century, is the value of energy, and particularly electricity, is not in the electrons that are generated by a power station. It's in the social impact of electricity on the economy, on human health, on human education, on human development more broadly, which is why public energy had to come in the middle years of the last century, right up until the 1990s. It was all energy was public, nearly all of it. There was virtually no exception. And then that stops because of the neoliberal privatization agenda, which has been absolutely disastrous all over the global north and the global south. And that's what we have to address, is the policy logjam that we need to confront. So Brian, I'm sorry, I don't think the startup model is going to work, but I'm happy to engage with you and talk about it more. Maybe we can all learn a little bit more about this together.
Thanks very much, Sean. And for those of you who missed it, Sean put his email in the chat box, so you can always contact him. There are many questions. Agnes, do you want to do your question quickly? It would be nice to see you.
Everyone, yes, I can take up my question. Such an informative topic, Sean, that you took us through. And my question was on the issue of carbon credits. What is your view on the issue of carbon credits, and whether is it sustainable over time? Because currently in my country, we have like conversations around issues to do with carbon credits, where there are talks around having forest in the country, then the forest are sold to the northern countries. How sustainable is the whole issue around the sale of carbon credits? Thank you.
Where are you based, Agnes? Where are you?
Kenya.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm in
great.
Kenya.
Hi. Actually, you've raised a good question, of course. I mean, again, I would say that there are carbon credits that under what used to be known as the Clean Development Mechanism at the UN, that entrepreneurs could get money if they could show that they were creating an environment that could sequester or store carbon. So as people were planting trees, for example, and then saying, my trees on my land has sequestered, sucked, because trees take carbon out of the atmosphere. So, they rely, that's what they are. Trees are basically carbon. So if they're growing, they take carbon out of the atmosphere, that then can be monetized, turned into, and then you apply for credits. That's one way of doing carbon credits. Meanwhile, the theory goes that if those who generate carbon dioxide have to pay for the carbon dioxide, they will find other ways of doing business. And I would again urge you to have a look at the World Bank's annual report on the state of carbon markets. Again, if you email me, I can send you the links. I want to help the comrades here get access to materials. But when you look at those materials, it's going to be full of how wonderful carbon pricing has been, how successful it's been. And then I will then send you my critique of the carbon markets. Because after 25 years, remember, carbon pricing, or putting a price on carbon dioxide, either for those who avoid carbon or generate carbon, this was supposed to be the policy. No other policy was required. All you needed to do was put a price on the externality. In this case, the externality is the pollution. If people pay for their pollution, then we are partially to where problem will be solved. Now think about that. In trade union circles, the term polluter pays principle, which is a World Bank term from the neoliberal world, has gotten a lot of popularity because it says, oh, if you're generating pollution, you should pay for that privilege of generating pollution. But what happens then? You're paying for pollution. Let's say you're paying 20 euros a ton for your CO2. But then you pass that charge down to working class people who have to buy the products. We saw this in France with the Yellow Vests revolt in 2018, when the government said, oh, we're going to put a pollution charge on diesel, and truck drivers and taxi drivers and school bus drivers who have to drive for a living revolted because they knew that they were paying for the pollution charge, but the pollution was ending up in the atmosphere anyway. So the quick answer to the question of carbon pricing, which carbon credits comes under that, is after, again, 25 years of trying, only a small fraction of the world's carbon dioxide has a price on it. And the price is so low, all it does is get passed down to the users, the working class. So it's not going to work. We have to take control over the sources of energy and the sources of pollution. And that means we need a radical change in the political economy in order to deal with that. Putting a price on it won't work. But Agnes, I thank you for your question, and let's talk because I've been in Kenya recently several times working on energy, so we can talk to you, Kitawu and the other unions there. I don't know if you're working with those, but we can get you connected.
Okay.
Thanks, comrade.
Thanks very much, Sean. And do send those links, please, because we will put it then in under your video lecture, and we can also send it via the platform to everybody. And of course, if you are interested, please do write to Sean. There are quite a few questions, Sean, on the fact that there is also the other problem that the working conditions in the renewables could be even more problematic actually than in the coal sector, where workers usually got well organized and had at least a bit of better conditions than the workers in the renewables. So if you can speak a bit to that, and particularly, and I think it's a question from Sarbasara following that, when we talk about renewables, it's not just the production in China or else of this renewable infrastructure, but it goes down to the minerals that are needed actually for the renewals, and that have to be taken into consideration. And finally, I want to pick up, since we are ending, if you can also wrap up with the question of, I think we had a question made from people that when they joined the workshop, when they registered, that fundamentally, is it possible to solve the question of energy transition under the capitalist system? So what are your thoughts on that?
In terms of I think the point of departure for or rather the way, not the departure, but the trade union discussions should avoid coming to a conclusion that some technologies are good and other technologies are bad. Some fuels are good and others are bad. We need to take a facts-based approach. And the question about the mineral inputs into, for example, polysilicon and others, copper used in solar, in wind turbines, there are lubricants and oils. There's also a massive amount of concrete involved. All of this is part of the discussion on energy transition. What we've been saying in the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy research is that all forms of energy have problems. They must be assessed based on their entire impact, both on the earth, and the atmosphere, but also on people. So we need that assessment. And under a if we got rid of capitalism tomorrow, we would still have to produce energy. We'd have to produce energy for those who don't have any, but also we'd need to clean up the energy for those who have it at the moment. So this would be an enormous multi-decade task. The way we do that is through basically putting all the human understanding of these questions together and saying, what is the best way to decarbonize the energy supply, reduce energy demand? That is a huge planning question that needs to be liberated from the question of markets and profit. Because otherwise, there's always a capitalist who's going to try to sell you or sell a government a quick fix. The latest one is hydrogen. I don't have time to go into details now, but there are billions and billions of public money being used to subsidize hydrogen in the hope that it's going to provide storage for wind and solar for when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. So this is one of the challenges, what they call intermittency or variability. The sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So how do we have a global economy that's built on variable supplies? The key is storage of energy, and hydrogen is being put forward as one of the options to do that. Now, again, our point of departure must be that we must have all the available facts in order to make an assessment of these different technologies. And that will be controversial because as a union movement, we're coming into the debates quite late. And a lot of people have got their positions. They've put their flag in the sand. They're either for 100% renewable energy, wind and solar, and then they ignore the technical problems, or therefore business as usual. What's the problem with coal, oil, and gas? What's the problem of 2 degrees, 3 degrees warming? So they've got their position. And then there are very many other positions in there. What's missing in this debate is the sustained trade union input that we can begin to sort out for ourselves, but also for our members, the difference between the misrepresentation of certain technologies and the realities of those technologies. That's a big task that we need the policy infrastructure and the research infrastructure in the movement that doesn't exist yet. We need to do that and commit to that. So I think that's the challenge we've got. There are no false solutions because there are no correct solutions. All the solutions have problems in one form or another. We just have to assess them as we go along.
And could you say anything to the question about this difference in the working conditions in the renewables and in the more traditional sources of energy?
Well, it's true that, say, for example, if you were a coal miner in Europe in the 1950s, you would be high wages and fully union. You had power, you had industrial power, you had some of the best living standards for energy workers probably in the world. And that wasn't true everywhere, but it was true in those perspectives. But if you look now at most of the fossil fuel use and renewable energy technologies are in the global south. So the living standards of coal miners in Mpumalanga in South Africa are low. And a lot of contracting out, a lot of non-union practices. The same is true in Indonesia. The same is true in China and India. You've got those union structures are being challenged. In the renewable sector, there is the production of the technologies, which is mostly dominated by China. There have been quite a lot of studies on the conditions there. I'm not an expert on it, but there have been some serious reports of exploitation of workers, as there have been across the global south, in terms of these industries. I don't think one is where I'm going with this is renewables or fossil fuels, neither is intrinsically better for workers than the other one. So in other words, it's how you organize. Can you organize? I just read this morning, there's a big strike in Korea of 23,000 Samsung workers who work in, producing Android phones and other products for Samsung. So it doesn't matter what the product is, it's how we organize and in those workplaces and in those centers. And so I think that's the approach we have to take. It's an organizing challenge.
Thank you very much, Sean. Perhaps we could get a final question. Is there somebody who want to make it? Otherwise, I read one from the chat. Any burning question? Okay, so let me read. There is one from Comrade Monirul from Bangladesh. Can we share any inspiring story of clean energy transition, which is also meeting workers' interest and demands? And I don't know, Comrade Issa, did you want to say something, or I'm not sure. Did you unmute to say something, or no? No, okay. Yes, so Sean, yes, please. And if you can wrap up also as a message to the group of people who are extremely interested and definitely have enjoyed. I mean, there are really very nice comments on the chat box about this talk. So if there is any message you want to give to everyone, even in terms of possibility of working together in the future.
Yes. This is obviously the challenges are huge, and we've got a lot of problems, but I would refer you to what's going to happen in Mexico on Sunday, right? There's an election in Mexico where the very likely winner is Claudia Sheinbaum, who has 6 commitments on energy. She's a climate scientist. She's a progressive left-wing politician. She's got a massive lead in the opinion polls. And she's following on from her predecessor, Andres Manuel López Obrador, the guy they call AMLO for short. AMLO said the neoliberal privatization of energy stops here. And he had taken in the last 3 years steps to nationalize the renewable sector. Iberdrola, the big Spanish multinational, was nationalized, to reassert the public utility, to putting into action energy self-determination. And Sheinbaum has made 6 commitments, one of which is to honor the country's climate commitments, pursuing renewable energy, but also asserting energy independence and self-control. This is a struggle that other countries are doing as well. In one form or another, there is a fairly long list of countries now who are taking their energy sectors back from the private sector into public control. If there's time, there won't be today, but I can send you information on this, where what we're calling the reclaiming of energy. Now, reclaiming of energy doesn't necessarily mean we will have a just transition, but it does mean that if we can get private profit out of the energy sector, there are possibilities to reorganize that sector in a way that can meet the kind of sustainable development goals that we're trying to achieve as a movement for the working class of the world. So I think there are some positive things. And a lot of those positive developments are not very visible on the world stage for obvious reasons. The newspaper headlines on Monday morning will say, Sheinbaum is elected, she's Jewish, and she's female. Now, both of those things are true, but those are not the most important things. The most important things is she has a program, a progressive pro-worker program that is supported by unions in Mexico. 1 million people were on the streets last May celebrating energy independence. And I think we're going to see some big developments, but let it not just be Mexico. We have to take that message everywhere in the world to promote the reclaiming of energy to public ownership and the reorganization of the energy sector on behalf of workers, and for the people and the planet. So I think there is a lot to be excited about in this debate. So please get involved, get in touch.
Thank you very much, Sean. This has been really brilliant conversation. Very, very interesting questions and very insightful responses. So we are very grateful for your time. For everybody, please follow Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. You can get their mailing, you can get into their mailing list and get regular updates about what's happening on the topic of energy. And of course, if you have any specific questions sometime in the future, we'll be more than happy to facilitate the communication with Sean. So thanks everyone, and see you tomorrow for 2 sessions back to back.